Welcome back once again, everyone. This is your fourth and yes, final installment in our Chapter 18 lecture series for your textbook Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Progressive Presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Mr. Woodrow Wilson. The focus question for this section is, how did the progressive presidents foster the rise of the nation state? Before we can really discuss or analyze anything about the rise of the United States as a fully fledged nation state, we need to first understand what exactly is a nation state. Essentially, what a nation state is a sovereign state whose citizens or subjects are relatively homogeneous in factors such as language, common descent, values, belief, and culture. And it requires a citizenry that identifies first and foremost with a national identity, as opposed to a regional, state, and local. Now, of course, due to the immigrant nature of the United States, going back from its very inception, this idea of common descent would, of course, be elusive to the formation of an American nation state. But there were concerted efforts to make language, values, beliefs, and culture much more homogeneous and unifying in this period. Progressives generally believe that only an energetic national government could establish the social conditions of freedom, and this too helped to foster this greater national identity. Theodore, also known as Teddy Roosevelt, was a very interesting man, to say the least. Perhaps my favorite president of all time. He had a very outsized and charismatic personality, and he translated that directly into the office of president. And he was an active and continuously engaged president. He campaigned initially under an idea he called the Square Deal, where he distinguished between good and bad corporations. Under Roosevelt's view, greedy financiers who were only interested in profit had no right to exist, and he was one of the first presidents to actively enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he actually used that act to dissolve a major corporation, the Northern Securities Company, that had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. As far as Roosevelt's relationship with labor and labor unions, Roosevelt believed that the president should be an honest broker in labor disputes, and in fact on several occasions he invited both employers and labor union leaders to the White House, where he facilitated the negotiations between them. In general, Roosevelt pushed for more direct federal regulation of the economy, and he passed such items as the Hepburn Act, which allowed the government to set railroad rates for the first time in American history, regulating prices for a specific industry. He also helped to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as the Meat Inspection Act. Both were direct responses to Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, which exposed the horrible, unsanitary conditions in meat processing facilities in America. Another progressive era movement that gained significant traction at this time, particularly under Theodore Roosevelt, was the conservation movement, which was the first environmental movement in American history. And it really stemmed from the activities of this gentleman right here, a man named John Muir, who founded the Sierra Club that sought to preserve forests from uncontrolled logging. And Muir's love of nature stemmed from his deep religious background, and his conservation movement quickly gained a broad following in the United States. And this was really partially a reaction to urbanization, as many Americans who now lived in cities began to see nature as a place for recreation and personal growth, and they wanted to help preserve nature and natural resources. Theodore Roosevelt, who himself was an avid outdoorsman, latched on really hard to this conservation movement and helped to make it federal policy. And Roosevelt moved to preserve parts of the natural environment from economic exploitation. And he helped to create the first national park system in American history. And this conservation movement also helped to promote the conservation of water in the West, where droughts were already becoming a significant problem at the time. The next president, William Howard Taft, was essentially Theodore Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. And for the most part, he continued the same sorts of policies that Roosevelt did under his administration. Taft pursued antitrust policy even more aggressively than Roosevelt, and he actually ordered the breakup of Rockefeller's Standard Oil, at the time the biggest corporation in the world, and endorsed this idea of the rule of reason to judge corporations. And essentially the rule of reason asked, is a corporation so big and powerful it inhibits competition? If so, it is unreasonable and should be broken up into smaller component parts. Taft also helped to pass the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which instituted a graduated income tax. Not the first time in American history this had happened, as the Union had passed a income tax law during the Civil War, but it quickly rescinded that after the war. This graduated income tax actually became a part of the Constitution, so we have Mr. Taft to thank for the income taxes we pay now to the federal government. Despite Taft's generally pursuing policies similar to Roosevelt, particularly in aggressively pursuing antitrust policies, Taft gravitated toward more conservative Republicans in his administration, leading for him and Roosevelt to have a break with each other, and Roosevelt actually launched a new political party, the Progressive Party, to compete with Taft's Republicans. The formation of Roosevelt's new Progressive Party had significant consequences for the next election, the election of 1912. This wound up being a four-way contest between Taft, Roosevelt of the Progressive Party, Woodrow Wilson, who ran for the Democrats, and Eugene Debs, who ran for the Socialist Party. And because of Roosevelt's popularity, which still remained at a high level even after he had left office, this contest essentially came down to a two-way contest between Wilson and Roosevelt, despite the fact that Taft was the incumbent president at the time. And Roosevelt and Wilson engaged in this campaign battle over the role of the federal government in securing economic freedom. And the two represented two competing strands of progressivism. Both believed government action was necessary to preserve individual freedom, but differed over dangers of increased government power. Wilson called his version of progressivism New Freedom. Wilson feared big government just as much as he feared big corporations, and his proposals were to strengthen antitrust laws. He supported the right to unionize and actively encouraged small business. Roosevelt dubbed his version New Nationalism. Roosevelt accepted the benefits of corporate bigness, but wanted to use the government to counteract the abuses of corporate power. He proposed heavy taxes on personal and corporate fortunes, and he advocated for strict federal regulation of industries. Overall, this progressive platform built a blueprint for a modern democratic welfare state. Now, for Roosevelt's part, he coupled his new nationalism with a new Americanism. Roosevelt wanted the new immigrants to fully Americanize, to adopt the language, the culture, the belief structures of American culture, and strengthen this national identity, which in turn would help strengthen this emerging nation state. Roosevelt believed that only people with the capacity for self-control were capable of participating in democracy. And this, under this mindset, essentially excluded most women and people of color from his idea of Americanism, because under this view, women and people of color were less had less capacity for self-control than white men in particular. This slide here shows the results of the presidential election of 1912, and as you can see, the Democrat Woodrow Wilson won in a landslide, clearly indicating that the majority of Americans preferred his version of progressivism over that of Roosevelt or Taft. Significantly too, as Taft, as the incumbent president, only won 2 states, and Roosevelt, only, despite his popularity, only won 6 states out of them all. The popular vote totals were also very decisive. 41.9% for Wilson, 27% for Roosevelt, 23% for Taft, and significantly, the socialist candidate Eugene Debs won almost 1 million votes, just about 6%, or right at 6% of the overall popular vote. During Wilson's first term, he proved to be a strong and effective leader, and he was able to pass many new progressive-style legislative actions. Such actions included the Underwood Tariff, which reduced duties on imports, but added an extra income tax on the wealthy to make up for those duties. He passed the Clayton Act, which exempted unions from antitrust laws and barred courts from issuing injunctions against strikes. A significant win for the labor movement. He helped pass the Keating-Owens Act, which limited employment of children under the age of 14. We really haven't gotten much into the child labor issue in these lectures, but child labor was a significant issue in this era, and there were many calls to regulate this going back decades. Wilson helped pass the Adamson Act, which established for the first time an 8-hour workday. This one specifically for railroad workers, but such attitudes toward the workday would quickly spread through other industries as well. He also passed the Warehouse Act, which provided credit for farmers who stored crops in government warehouses, which was one of the central things that the old populist movement advocated for back in the late 19th century. Overall, Wilson generally embraced greater government supervision of the economy, and much of this went against his own campaign rhetoric and agenda, and aligned more with the agenda of Roosevelt and Taft than it did on his New Freedom agenda that he campaigned on. He helped to establish the Federal Reserve System, which placed the government in regulation of the banking industry. He helped to found the Federal Trade Commission, which was charged with investigating unfair business activities. And in general, government at all levels assumed the authority to protect and advance industrial freedom. And with that, we conclude both Part 4 and overall our lecture for Chapter 18 of your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, I hope you learned a lot. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.